All right, let's talk the next step of texturing something. It was alluded to in the previous lecture, but we need to go over the details of how to actually do it. And that step is skinning. You may also be heard this referred to as pelting or UV work, UV unwrapping. All of those are accurate terms for it. I tend to refer to it as skinning. And skinning is the notion of taking a object who is in the 3D and laying it out so that it's 2D instead. Think of this like taking a globe and laying it out flat so that it can be a map. Or taking a bear and taking off its skin and laying it out flat so that it can be a bearskin rug. Morbid analogy, I know, but there's a reason that it's called pelting. The idea is to take this 3D object and unwrap it, unfold it, so it lays out flat with the smallest level of distortion. There is always going to be distortion when we take something from the 3D and lay it out in the 2D. And if you've ever looked into it, there's a whole lot of arguments about the way the world map is laid out, generally displayed. It's very eccentric, making some countries look bigger than others. For political reasons, there's a lot of distortions up, especially up top at the poles. That happens, and it's a little bit of a mess because of that, because there's no truly 100% real way to represent the 3D as the 2D. So we have to accept that we're going to have distortions. In today's day and age, there are some ways around this. We could paint directly on the model, and there's some programs like ZBrush who are all about that. But the traditional, the classic way, the way that things are still done quite a bit of the time, is to take our 3D object and unwrap it with the UVs into a 2D object. So we're going to look at going through that and how to make this happen. This model here is a simplified little owl blob. It's our little houlette. These files are available to you if you want to download them and follow along with me and look at what I'm doing. Remember, you can pause the video at any time, rewind it, try a step again. If you do take the time to follow along with me, it's going to be very helpful for you in the future because you've experienced this. Likewise, you could listen through this video once and then go back and listen through parts of it and try along. Whatever works for you, but I would highly encourage you to download this file and play around with it. As always, remember though, this is just an example file and every single model is going to be different for you to take it and unwrap it, just like every model is different for you to take it from concept and model it. So we're going to walk through that and how to do this. Now, when you open this, there's actually going to be two figures here. I've simplified it down for one just for our viewing purposes. And this is just a low polygonal figure. There's nothing special about this figure really whatsoever. And if we look at it in the smooth view, we can see what we intend the final figure to work with. Now, even though we're going to want to smooth it in the end and get to this higher level look, there's a real advantage of working with our unsmoothed figure because there's a lot less mess. Every one of these edges becomes something we have to deal with when we take it in and unwrap it. So if we're looking at a more complicated version of the figure that's already been smoothed like this, that's a lot more edges we have to go in and solve and deal with and handle. But we have a process in which we can deal with our we can deal with our lower polygonal figure here and transfer that data to our higher polygonal figure and clean any mess ups. Just like with modeling, it's better if we deal with a lower amount of information and then scale it up. So I don't want to deal with this higher version right now. I just stuck it on its own layer to hide so that we can deal with this one. So eventually our model will look like this, but for the moment, we're going to be dealing with this because there's less information we have to manipulate. Now, every single object already has a UV map. It's just as ugly as sin to start with. And on our modeling tab, there's a tab called UV. And if we click on that, this is where all of our UV information is. And the thing that we're going to be predominantly using is our UV editor. Our UV editor is a showcase of what's going on with that object. And to be perfectly honest, I forget if I've run any processes on this UV editor yet. We're going to walk through them though, so it really doesn't matter. But every single thing has a default layout. So we're going to go through understanding today how this UV editor looks, how it's laid out and organized, how we can make the best 2D version of our 3D object, and the tools that we need to know to be able to make that happen, how we need to be able to cut and sew and modify this object together, and then how we can finalize that process. Texturing can be a highly artistic process, and it is a highly artistic process. This doesn't mean that you should panic if you're not an artistic person. There's some nice base level tricks and tips that we can use to get around that. Those of you who are my digital media students, though, this should really be up your alley, and you can do some really very interesting things with it because of your knowledge with Photoshop and things like that. Those of you who are not artistic, though, we're going to walk sort of the baseline of what you need to get around and walk through those processes also at a later date. But we're going to go over the basics. So today, our whole lecture is focused around this UV editor and how we're going to put that together and make it work. All right, so when we're going to want to start unwrapping something, we want to start with the best base possible. And in our UV base, we have a few different layouts that we can go with. And some of them are better for certain types than others. We're going to jump down here to cylindrical, planar, and spherical in the middle. So I'm going to select my object here. I'm going to go ahead and click on cylindrical, and this GUI system pops up. And if you have your UV editor up like I do, you can see that our UV editor changes right away. And what we basically have is we have a wraparound showing us how it's going to try to cut the figure. So a cylindrical is basically looking at everything being a cylinder. So it's basically looking at how we can unwrap something, as in all essence peeling apart a coffee can if we had to have the top and the bottom attached to the coffee can. Each one of these, cylindrical, planar, spherical, has a slightly different look to the system, but all of them have these little colored dots. And by moving around these little dots, we can see that we change the way our layout works. So we'll talk about some best practices here in a moment, but I want to walk through the way that these different three basic ones look here. So cylindrical is basically just trying to do a flat slice and unwrap. It will always try to keep your front in one piece. So this center point, which is this blue box in the middle, is always going to try to be facing on the front of your object, which means it's going to attempt to split it down the back. We can see where any cut happens, where any edges for our model happens, because they're going to be highlighted on our model in this big white line. So this big white line here that goes through my model lets me know that we're basically cutting it apart, and that's where we have an edge in our UV editor. So this white line here follows along with this edge of the model here in our UV editor. And if I go to edges and actually look at this edge or select it here, you can see that the same things are being selected in our UV editor. So wherever we've got this highlighted white line, when we're looking at our model in UV node, that's where it's being cut across in our UV editor. So cylindrical is trying to keep it as one piece as possible, cutting it along the back. Sorry, going back to object mode on that, clicking on cylindrical. You need to be on object mode if you're doing any of your UV editors. So that's cylindrical's attempt. If we go and we look at planar, planar wants to deal with objects who are flat. It's basically creating a plane. So for 3D objects like this, it's really doing a poor job because it's not trying to unwrap things and lay them flat. Really, it's trying to look at a plane and smush everything onto that. So we have this weird sort of side view. Planar you should only use for flat objects, or basically flat objects. Spherical is really very often one of the best bets. Spherical is kind of like cylindrical. It's going to put the front at the front. It's going to want to cut it along the back. But spherical tries to wrap around more of the object. It tries to do more of a wraparound on the top and the bottom, and we can see that we see more of the bottom clearly here, more of the top clearly here than we did in cylindrical. Spherical tends to be one of my favorites to start with. Another real advantage of spherical here is we can change very much how it's split and what's important to us. by where we place that middle marker. So if seeing the top of the head is important to us, we can move that so the top of the head is a little bit more parsed out well. How do we know what's important to us, where we want to put these markers, be it spherical or cylindrical? How do we know what we want to see? You want to hide your seams. We want those places where we're splitting it apart to be invisible as possible. So we need to think about the way this character is going to be used and displayed. If this this owl is going to be mostly seen as like a prop piece, so we're going to be seeing it from the front. If it's a smaller prop piece, we're going to see it from the front and down. Then our most important parts is the front of the figure and the top of the figure. If we're rarely going to see the bottom or the back side, that's where we want the cuts to be. If on the other side, this is a character that we're going to have in a video game, and it's going to be a third-person character where our camera is floating around somewhere on the back here, and we're walking around the world with it, well then, for the most part, our back is really important. So we might want to move around this whole spacing so that our back is the most important part of what we've got going on, and manipulating it from there. I've gotten this quite twisted around at this point. So we may have different reasons why we want to move this around to be in different places. But we need to say, how is this character going to be used? And so where do we need these things to face? For the exercises of this class, you're going to assume that we're going to be seeing these characters where their faces are important. So for this, follow along. For the homework, for our project 2, project 3, we're going to look at the face being important, and generally the back and the bottom being least important. So if this is something like that, that's what we want to do. We do the same thing with humans. We try to hide seams underneath hair. For example, underneath clothing pieces, we would try to hide seams if the character is always in clothing where seams naturally are. So if we were cutting down legs and the figure was wearing a jeans, we would actually want to put the seaming where the jeans are on the figure. One of the texture artists at Disney, who's rather high up in the hierarchy, she was the texture, for example, on Rapunzel, not just the show, on for Tangled, like literally Rapunzel was the character she textured. So she got a headline hero character underneath her belt, and she says one of the best things that she ever did in college was to take a pattern making class with the theater department, because she learned how clothing was constructed, so she learned better where to hide the seams when she was UV unwrapping something. So we would use tricks like that. If it was something like a dog or a cat, the best place to do it is on the underside. So we would cut along the belly and up the inside hidden parts of the arm, because we're generally not going to see that part of the animal. We're generally going to be seeing the back and the top of it and the outside of those limbs. So we would hide those seams on the inside. We might also cut along seams along color changes if that's going to help things be visible. So there is a bit of thinking and thought process that you want to put in when you're doing UV unwrapping about where is best to hide the seam. So before you do any unwrapping, you need to think about where is best to hide those seams and manipulate those appropriately. And part of that is experience, but part of it is also thinking about where are we least likely to see this character from if it's animated. So I tend to go for spherical. It's my personal preference for unwrapping, but we do have access to, again, the cylindrical if we're doing it. We also have a few other things going on here. And one of them up top here, I'm going to go back into object mode, is automatic. Automatic puts up these visible planes. And these visible planes here are basically looking around our character from the top, bottom, front, sides, back, and all of those things like this, and trying to assess and break it up into that. So this is a lot more of a confusing layout, but we see we have pretty much our right side, our left side, our top, our bottom, our front, our back. And the computer is trying to take its best guess information about where to split things up. And sometimes it does smart things. So the beak is basically cut out here. That's done. It recognized that as a series of edge loops. That probably means that should be a separate piece, and it cut it out from the front, which is convenient, as you'll see down the line, because we want to do things like make that beak a different color, for example. The problem is it split that beak up. If we go and select some of our faces, it split that beak up into a number of faces it hasn't kept close to each other. Automatic leaves all of these extra little bits. And that can be a problem and potentially a benefit. And a lot of this is really going to be about the way that your brain works, whether or not you prefer something like this automatic layout or whether or not you prefer something like our spherical layout. And they both have their advantages and their disadvantages. So let's go ahead and talk about these two. And when I'm talking about the spherical, I'm also including cylindrical in here. It's just that spherical is my preferred for a number of base objects. But we're going to talk about the advantages and the disadvantages of these two different means, and then gets into a little bit of how we can handle them. So, if we're looking at our spherical here, the advantage of it is it starts out as one piece, and it starts out with relatively clean lines. The cut along the back of this figure is pretty clean for the most part, and we can see that here on our UV unwrap. We have this weird extension up here, which is this zag that our cut takes. Instead of going all the way to the top point, for some reason it's done a turnaround. Computers and programs, as smart as they are, even something as big and smart as Maya, makes issues. And so if we're looking at something that's spherical, we have a lot more cutting apart that we need to do. We have some places that we're going to have to fix, where we're going to have to cut them and sew them back together. And if we do want things like we want to cut out the eyes and the beak because we want them to be separate colors, or even this whole face plate here because we want it to be a separate color, we're going to have to go in and cut those out manually. So if we're going through a spherical process, we're going to have a lot more cutting to do. And when we're cutting something apart, we're having to do some of the manual thinking of how do we want to take something 3D and lay it flat. And that takes practice, quite frankly, to see how those things lay flat and looking between them and trying to minimize distortion. So if we're going across the process of taking something spherical, we have to think about how to lay it out as flat as possible. And to use that, we're going to be using some tools here in the UV editor. So if it didn't open by default, go over to the Tools tab in the UV editor and click on Show UV Editor, and it opens up the UV toolkit. I personally like them tied together. I like them stuck as one unit. That's personal preference. And we're going to walk through the basics of how we would manipulate this from the spherical layout, and then we'll go walk through to look at how we would do that from the automatic layout also. So when we're looking to unwrap something, we want to break things up where we're going to have completely separate lines of pattern. So if we're going to have an object that in a real figure would be a separate element, even if we modeled it as one piece, we want to cut it apart. So we would want to cut off along the seam lines around a shirt from the skin because they're separate elements. And if we can cut them apart from each other, one, we have a better chance of laying them out because we're not trying to deal with like a whole human figure. We can lay out different parts separately, but also it makes it easier because we can just mass paint a whole area to be purple for the shirt and peach for the skin, or brown for the skin and yellow for the shirt, or whatever type of character we're manipulating within there. If it's a modeled pattern, so like say we were looking at a tiger, we would not individually want to cut out each and every individual stripe. We would actually be going through and painting the stripes because that's a blended pattern. What we want to cut off is anything that we know is a completely separate harsh change of color, or if it's a separate material. So looking at our little owl here, well, eyeballs are separate than the feathers. The beak is separate than the feathers. Those are all obvious splits here. In this figure, we're also going to cut out this sort of face area because we're looking at the idea that we have a stark color change from the rest of the body to the face. You can make a consideration to potentially cut out the wings depending on what the color scheme that you know you're going for is and such, not like that. But we always want to break that down. Again, if we were looking at a human, we would be cutting off the clothing from the rest of the body, the hair from the rest of the body, etc., etc. So we know that we're going to want to cut off some of these objects. And we also know that we need to lay this out with the smallest amount of distortion. We have a lot of distortion down here at the bottom because we get this wavy warp for lines that we know are basically straight that we have to deal with. And we have a lot of distortion going on here up top because we can see how weird what's basically a circle here is spread out. And we have some arrows. So depending on your personal preference, you can start in a few different places. My personal order of operation is deal with any major issues. So a major issue that I see is this piece that's hanging out by itself. Anytime that you have one of these pieces who's just sticking out by itself, hanging off into the edge, we're going to want to deal with that. And a lot of that is usually about completing a cut or a line or undoing some cuts so that they're sewn together and things like that. So my first step is to deal with these extra annoying fiddly bits. Then I prefer to go in and cut out any pieces that I know are going to be separate, because by cutting out those pieces, I can then go into the third step easier, which is laying out the forms with the least amount of distortion. And the way we're going to do that is by using our various tools over here in the UV toolkit. Our most important tab is going to be the Cut and Sew tab. It's where our main tools are. Cutting allows us to select a part and remove it or slice an edge open to create those seams. Sewing is the opposite. It allows us to sew those pieces together and move those things together. So our very basic level that we've got to do is go through and use our Cut and Sew tools over here. So looking at this figure, when we know we have this annoying bit that's hanging off on the side, we want to look at this and say, is there anything that we need to sew together that we feel shouldn't be split and is? Or is there anything that we need to cut apart and stitch somewhere else on this 2D piece here? Well, I don't like this little turnover. I don't like that it does this zag. I would rather that it doesn't do any of this two parts of this L right here. And so what I can do is click on those places. I can either click on them in my UV editor, or I can click on them in the 3D model. I tend to jump back and forth depending on which place it's easier to visualize. And you'll notice if I select them in one, it selects them on the other. So if I click on this white line right here saying, I know I want that being sewn together, it's very easy to see on my 3D model. You'll notice it selects all of those places in my UV editor here in blue. And it's actually selecting both edges. Anywhere where there's a cut, if I select part of that cut area, that represents two edges in my UV editor because it's two edges of the slice. So just keep that in mind. Any one of these white lines becomes two different selections in my UV editor. So if I select this, even if I can't understand what's going on here in the UV editor, I can very easily see that on my 3D model. This is why there's a lot of jumping back and forth. And I'm going to go over here and I'm going to hit sew. It sews them together. You can see that there was a manipulation here that went on my UV editor. And you can see that's no longer a white line on my model. I'm going to go and do it to the other little piece here. I could have done them both together, but it's easier to showcase. And now I have that line who's nice and happy. Now, it cut those apart for a reason because it was trying to figure out how to split this circle up here at the top. So generally, if you're sewing things together in the spherical or cylindrical mode, you're going to want to go through and do some cutting. I have a few options. I could take this line right here and cut it up so that that cut goes all the way to the point. And if seeing my figure from the top isn't a huge amount of importance, that wouldn't be an issue. If I wanted to keep the center circle more contained, another option that I could do, instead of this cut going along in this asymmetrical loop, I could do a little slice along the top that would let that circle sit more. So I could cut along the edge of the circle. That would be entirely another option. It would really just depend on my need of this model. I'm just going to go ahead and cut that crossed horizontally here. I'm going to, again, select any edges I want. And I'm going to go over here and I'm going to click cut. Now, when I cut, nothing's changed by default. And that's because sewing has to move things back because we've undone an edge. Cutting snips something, but it doesn't make them move because we can cut something into smaller pieces and keep all the pieces just where they laid. Whenever we do a cut, we should get into the habit of going to this next tab over, Unfold, another very important tab of ours, and unfolding our figure. So I'm going to right click and hold on my UV editor on the figure. And go over to UV shell. So I'm selecting my whole shell. So right click and held to UV shell, clicked on the whole thing, and I'm going to go over to unfold, and I'm going to click unfold. And now we can see that it's updated and changed with the information I have in there. So whenever you do cuts, get in the habit of going over and unfolding them. Unfolding them is basically recomputing the layout to lay it out as flat as possible. Let's talk about a few more tools in here. We can optimize. You can see optimize was a smaller shift, but it's going to go through in that unfolded figure and try to figure out the best way to lay it out. I would always encourage you to click unfold first and then optimize. The other thing that can be important for us is to lay these things out in very specific ways that we're not going to get into here in just this moment, but we may want to use some of these tools to lay things out, move things around, shifting things. So that's what some of these things like the straight and the UV shells and things like that are in there. But for the moment, let's worry about cut, sew, and unfold. So if we know the edges we want, and we can very easily select them, we can always just go in and select our edges. And again, we can click that cut if we need to cut them apart. If things are already cut, we can click on them. We can hit sew, and we can sew them together. We also have the cut tool and the sew tool. The cut tool allows me to go in live and cut a whole area out. So if I have the cut tool active, if I click and hold and drag, I'm basically cutting along a fresh line. So you don't have to know where to select things and go through and select them and then hit cut. We can just use the cut tool and go in and make a slice. Think about it going in with a razor blade and just cutting along an object. The sew tool is the opposite. We can click and go through and sew things together just by clicking and holding and dragging along it. So if we don't have things pre-selected, we can use the cut tool and the sew tool. This is mostly useful when you're moving pieces together in something like the automatic view, like you need to then paste them together. But I wanted to go over them here where I'm going over the base tools. So I did the first part. I got rid of any of those weird hangups. Now I want to go through and cut out these objects. So I'm going to go back into that edge mode, and I want to sort of look at my model and figure out where those pieces are that I want to cut them apart. And I would highly encourage you to jump back and forth at this place between the smooth view and the not smooth view. Because in the not smooth view, it looks like this is the edge of my eyeball. It looks like this is where I want to have my selection, is all around this. But if I go into the smooth view, that's way too far out. This is really the edge of my eyeball. So jumping between the smooth and the non-smooth view at this point is important because we just want to cut out where that actual part of the object is that's supposed to be a textural difference. Our eyeballs, we want to be different. We're going to cut them out differently. So remember, if we have a complete edge loop, we can just double click and select the whole thing. Makes it really easy. We can also, of course, shift select multiple edges. But on our eyes, we can just double click on that right edge loop. The whole thing is selected here. We can just go and click cut. Again, cut will not move anything around by default, but we now have our white line here. We know that's cut. I'm going to go and do the same thing to the other eyeball. Cut that out. I'm going to go and do the same thing to the beak. Again, checking the beak in the smooth view and making sure I have what I want selected. Click cut. Beak is cut out. So by going through and doing this process of cutting out these objects, we can go through and take away those things that we know are going to be different colors and then work on refining them. Do always double check that you do have the whole selection you want. Remember, sometimes your edge loop isn't complete because you've gone in and added in various segments. So you may want to double click to do that whole selection of the edge loop. I'd always recommend checking it on your UV editor before you always hit cut. If it doesn't cut all the way around, though, you can just manually select it and cut it. So I have these pieces who are selected and made different from the rest of the object. We can see all of those thick white lines. I'm going to right click and hold on my UV editor, go back into the UV shell, and you'll notice now each one of these I can select separately from the whole body. So we can select them separately, and if we hit that W key, we can move them. Because if we're going to want to paint, say, both eyes black, we can just put both eyes together. And we can move things around. Now, when we're moving things and when we're laying things out, there's this whole weird grid that we need to understand before we go into any more details about refining our shape. And that's the fact that our active area, I'm just going to move this out of the way. Our active area is from the 0 here in the middle to 1, going vertically and going horizontally, and the box that makes. So 0 to 1 in the Y, 0 to 1 in the X. This here is our active area for our UV. This is where we need everything to fit, and at the moment, everything doesn't fit in there. So we need to work on how those are going to be, and how those are going to be spaced out. Our easiest way to do that is go down here to Arrange and Layout. Select everything. Make sure you're in UV shell mode, and then I just dragged a bounding box, click and held and dragged to have everything selected. I could have clicked on them one by one. And I'm going to go here, and I'm going to click Layout. And Layout smushes everything into that one by one box. Now again, computer can be dumb. Why are my eyeballs in different spaces? I want my eyeballs to be in the same space. So I'm going to probably want to move them out. I want a decent amount of space around all of my objects of different colors so that I can very easily just smush around colors and color them. So you're going to want to go in through some manual moves, but that gets you there in the first place. There's going to come a time where you're going to want to stop clicking that layout because you're going to want to go in and manually change things, but it's a good starting place. Layout, though, doesn't consider things like level of detail, level of accuracy. Because we've only got this one by one space to work in, we want the things that we're going to have a lot of detail in to be big enough for us to paint that detail. So if a lot of detail goes into this face, we may want to go and make sure to scale up that face so that it's bigger so that we can paint that detail in there. So we physically have the room and the information to paint that in there. I just used the scale tool. So just went in there with R, just like we scale things in models, to scale that up. But we may want to move things and scale things around accordingly. So even though the layout tool gets us there, using the other tools can help us. The other set of tools that can help us are our Align and Snap. So if I want these two eyes to, example, sit exactly, I'm gonna make this a little bit more obvious, sit exactly side by side, I could select both of these eyes and go over to Align, and I can move over to align them along the center middle. And you can hover over all of these to see what they're doing. Digital media students, you'll know these from Illustrator and Photoshop, but I can choose to align them. Now my eyes are aligned side by side. So we can use the Align and Snap to help refine this, and we can also just move things around manually. You don't have to do the layout stage at this point, but it's a good idea to keep it in your head as you continue working. If you don't want to do it until the very end, you don't have to do it to the very end, but I wanted to explain this concept of this one by one box being what's important to us. So again, did the first step, got around any weird cuts that I needed to fix. Did the second step, my personal preference of the second step, and moved all of the main objects that were going to be separate, distinctly separate textures or colors into their own space. And now I need to look at the object and figure out if there's anything else I want to cut in order to make this layout better, to make this layout more effective. And we basically want to look for anywhere where there's a large amount of distortion going on. We get a little bit of distortion up top here. We can see that it's really a perfect circle on the model, but it's not a perfect circle here. So we could decide that we do want to go in and do some modification up in that space. Anywhere we have a sphere narrowing to the top, just like on a globe to a map, we're going to have some issues. We also have some distortion going along in the bottom. This fans out really dramatically. Luckily, it's on the bottom, so distortion probably doesn't matter as much because we're unlikely to see this figure from the bottom, but we still may want to go in and do some shifts. Within there, you get a bit of distortions on the wing. They're riding a little wide, so there's a few things that we might think about going in and doing. I switch this back to UV shell mode. We can go in and literally just scale things along if we think scaling is going to fix it, and it does help, like in the wing area. But we may also need to be thinking about going in and adding in some extra cuts. So wherever we have things where we've got too much distortion, the way to fix that increased level of distortion is for us to go in and add more cuts. Because the more cuts we have, the more things can lay flat. The problem with the more cuts we have, of course, is that we have more seams we have to deal with. So I basically went on the bottom and finished the seam all the way to the front. And you notice every time I did a cut, I also unfolded it back and forth, cut and fold, to see how it looks. And we can see that we've solved some of our distortion. It's definitely less distorted around the tail area here, but we've also potentially increased more distortion down here at the middle. You can undo this to go back with your Control Z or Command Z and undo that, but you just need to sort of play around with the model to try to minimize the amount of distortion. And this does get weird and wonky. This is where the large majority of the time is going to be spent inside of this process, is just this fiddly bits. When you're looking at texturing is really two very distinct halves. It's going through and doing the UV unwrapping, and then it's doing the painting. And you can't rush with the UV unwrapping or you're never going to have a good painted model. End of story. And especially for you guys, where I'm not expecting you to necessarily be artists, UV unwrapping is going to often be the large majority of a grade. So you have to have this back and forth process between the two. And you need to try to think about what's important and where you want those cuts to be. And again, part of that is just getting used to the process. But when you're happy, you're going to make sure everything's laid up, everything's in that 1x1 box, that you've moved things and scaled things so that you have things the correct size, and you're good to go, basically. So if we start with cylindrical or spherical, it's about fixing any areas with bad cuts, cutting apart the important pieces that are different textures or distinctly different colors, going through and fitting any distortions. And that gets us this level of layout. We do have another option though, and that's our automatic. Automatic is good for those type of brains who likes to piece pieces together and think about how we take all of the disjointed parts and make them into one. It can be nicer with more complicated figures with limbs and arms or distinct pieces of clothing. It's going to try to split those apart automatically, but there is a lot of hunting and pecking sometimes to find those various pieces and snap them back together. So when we're going through and we're unwrapping things by the automatic function, we may want to go in and click on the little box to look at our settings. Our settings are going to include the number of planes. 6 is the default and usually good to stick with. You can make it increase, but you're going to have more cuts. We can choose if we care about distortion or the number of pieces more. I prefer to leave mine on fewer pieces, but sometimes you may need to go into the less destruction of this. Within there, the rest of this I generally don't go through and mess with too much. But we can decide how we want things to lay out into a square, puts them into this nice happy square for us. We can choose if we're going to scale things uniformly or not bother any scaling of the objects as they go into here as a shell. So there's a number of other little things to get in here, but in basic level, I'd recommend just leaving this alone, but I did want to point that out there. If you choose to do automatic, it's good playing around with those various functions and see what works best. But if we click automatic, we again can see this layout happening. And it's done some things. This is definitely a model I would not recommend using automatic on, but hey, it's here. When we're going in an automatic and we're looking at things, we have to think about what things separated that we didn't want separating. And how do we need those things to go? And it's a lot of sort of moving around a piece and figuring it out. Automatic really does work best with a figure who has things that you will want to separate, like a clothed figure or things like that, where some of that automatic separation can really help you. This figure mostly wanting to be one solid shape and one solid color with as few seams as possible is not the ideal figure to showcase automatic, but I did want to talk about it because it may serve some of you better with your characters. Automatic often gets to be the point of needing to go in and looking at what it split apart that you didn't want it to split apart. So it split off the underside of the wings, for example, from my figure. And I don't want those to be split apart. So in automatic, what we may need to go in and say, hey, where is this split apart and where do we not want it to be split apart? So I found this underside of the wing by hovering through and selecting my, hovering through and selecting edges. So I can move it back until it's basically in the right area and try to get those things manipulated through into the right place. So what we basically have happening here is a need to take our UV shells and move them into the right area and then restitch them together. So move a wing back, go in and use the stitching if there's places that aren't part. So it very much is like putting together a board game puzzle or whatnot. The annoying thing about our UV unwrapping here is it can do things in some special ways. And we're actually showcasing this here, not by plan, but just because what it did. It kind of flipped this UV around in a bit of a funky way. It's not lining up as a one-to-one because that should be connected to there, but it's at the other side. And this can be a real danger with how things move and unwrap. I'm going to go find a slightly easier piece, I think, to talk about. Yeah. Okay. Let's go with the front here. We don't want this seam along the front from the side. We want those pieces to be sewn together. So I can see this little cutout here. That matches this cutout here. If I go to my edges, those edges are both being highlighted. I want to sew those together. So with UV unwrapping automatic, if there's things that are brought apart that we don't want to be brought apart, the best thing to do is sort of overlap them, smush them on top of each other, go in with our sew tool, and smush all around with that sew tool until they're sewn back together. So this gets to be this process of going in with moving around our objects until they're lined back up, just like a jigsaw puzzle. And when they're lined back up, we're going to go in with that sew tool and sew them back together. So it's this real sort of back and forth process. I did not mean to do that. It's this real back and forth process therein. And that can be an annoyance. Some people really hate this process of going through and sewing it together. So again, it's very much the same sort of thing where we're going to go in, we're going to sew, we're going to unfold. I would encourage also probably pretty often going into that layout and clicking that layout button so that we can see where things are supposed to fit and see where things are supposed to be set up so we can move things in the right place. But it's rather than cutting things apart, it's putting things back together. And the reason why I want to introduce both ways of doing this is because some of your guys' brains are going to work better with one way than the other way. And so knowing that both options are available to you is nice, just because one way may work better for you than the other way. But whichever way you decide to do it, it's perfectly okay. And different models are going to respond to different ways. I will tell you that personally, not that it matters in the least, personally, I tend to prefer to go with spherical or something like that if it's anywhere near a blob figure and cut things apart. Even if it's a more complicated figure, I tend to start with something like spherical because my brain's pretty good at understanding a mess of things that are overlapping and how to cut them apart. And I heavily use the 3D model to help that. If your brain's really not good at looking a lot of overlapping lines and parsing them out, you may be better with automatic, where even if it's a mess, everything's separate and you can locate all the different pieces and just smush the sew tool over them. That is perfectly acceptable also. It can very much depend on what you're doing. Some problems that you might find along the way. If you're ever wondering where your tool to go back to the UV mode is, it means that you're also already accessing a tool, and the tool that we're accessing is what our radial menu is. You can just hit Q, then right click, and your regular tools will be back there for us. So that's one thing that I know will be a problem for students potentially. So whenever you're lost, hit Q, reset it to your standard tool, and most of your things should become happy and go back to them. You do have the ability to manipulate vertexes specifically. So one of the ways that you can work through on a distortion is to select edges or faces or vertices and manually move those. Bear in mind, whenever we move those, we're also moving their partner by default. So you do need to think about how those are and how those things are spaced. You do have the ability to rotate things, especially if you're using automatic. You're going to want to go through and rotate things around because some things are going to be wonked off in a different way. You don't have to set things up in the same way like your figure is. So I didn't need to rotate this front to top, but it does make some things clearer with what I'm going on and what I'm doing within that process. And that can make it clear just both to visually see things, but also to arrange things and cut them together. The main key is to make sure things lay flat because we want them to be laid out. So it doesn't matter if there are weird things necessarily like this bottom hanging separate from the sides. If we're like, I'm okay with that being a potentially hard color edge, it's never going to leave the surface it's on. Doesn't matter to us. You can do that. Think about trying to like unfold a cube. It's going to become this sort of cross-like shape, even though that's nothing like it looks like in the row space. The main thing is to have all of these cuts in the important place. And if you are using automatic, make sure all of these bizarre little things find their appropriate space. So make sure we know where all of these things need to sit and need to belong so we can get them in the right place. If you are going to go with automatic, you can't have any little stray spaces. We really need to go sure and make sure all of those things are put into place and all of those things are done up appropriate. So you do need to go through if you're using automatic and make sure that there's no other little extra boxes running around in that process. So I've gone back to the spherical layout that I had previously just because it's the one that's closer to done. This maybe could use a little bit more love, especially like this edge here. I may want to go in, need to click my Q tool to be on the right tool. I may want to go in with the vertices specifically, and I may want to move those vertices and adjust some of those things around. So this could probably use a little bit more love in reality to get rid of some of the distortions, but it's close enough for our purposes right here. Please note, symmetry works here too. If I want to make sure things are symmetrical, I can make sure that I have symmetry on, and I can go through and I can modify things with symmetry so I don't have to select both sides. So do still take advantage of symmetry if you need to take advantage of symmetry therein. But again, I could probably go in and do a little bit of refinement on some of these edges, move some things around. Again, that last 10% of that nitty gritty, moving things around is some of the most important parts of this process, but we're calling this happy for the demonstration at the moment. Now, when we're happy with our UV layout here, definitely make sure you go and save. But what we need to pull out is a UV snapshot. So if we click on this little UV snapshot, it's going to save out this texture so that we have the ability to work on it. We're going to want to make sure that it's saved somewhere that we know where to save it. The file type by default wants to be a Maya IFF. Your program may or may not open that depending on what's going on within there. It is relatively safe for us to save it as a JPEG or a PNG. I'm going to change my image format here to a PNG. And then when you think about the size, if you're trying to do a UV maps that have really low size, so they're really nice and optimized for something like a mobile game, we may go smaller. We may go to 1024 as a size. If we're going with big old 4K textures, we're really going to ramp up our textures here to be a very big size. I tend to look to work by default at 2048. Again, this is a little bit old school of me, but it's just where I sit. But we're basically all ratios of these increasing. So 1024, 2048, the same ratios going up and down because of crazy math reasons having to do with computers working in base 8 and things like that are some of the things that you want to go. So go ahead and type in 2048. We want our X and our Y to be the exact same size. Your edge color decides on the ways that the edges are going to show up. PNG will keep transparency in there, so it will be transparent with light lines. GIF will not keep that. By default, again, we have our 1, 1 as our UV tile range. You can change this range. So for some reason, working this 1, 1 is annoying to you, you can shift it, but 1, 1 is what we're used to within there. But we want to go through and shift those things as need be. And when we're happy, we click apply. It was screaming at me because I was in a different mode there. You can always right click back on your object, go to object mode, click on it fresh, and it will work. So apply, saves it out, apply and close, closes that file there. I'm sorry, doesn't close the file, it closes this menu option. I just changed the location there so I can go through that again. Apply and close. It will tell you that it's saved down here in your little command bar. So it's telling me that it's saved and what it's saved as. I always like to put the name of the file. So this is the Houlette and this is the UV map. So I always like to put like Houlette UV. So I know this is my base UV. Now, my darlings who are my digital media people, go forth in Photoshop. It's a nice, easy program. You can even set up Photoshop networks where it's reading, instead of a PNG file that you have to upload repeatedly, you can read the whole Photoshop file itself. So if you make a change in the Photoshop file and save that Photoshop file, those things will save through without you needing to save out images and either replace those images or re-upload those images. There's huge advantages in using Photoshop, and in the classroom where we all have access to Photoshop, we would be using that. But we're also going to walk through some other things here. So this next part, we're going to talk about how we can take this and how we can color it. Even if you know how to use digital coloring programs, I'm going to talk through some theories or concepts that are important for when we're thinking about going through and coloring something that are useful to listen to. Those of you who don't have Photoshop, there's a few freeware programs out there that you can go and take advantage of, or cheap programs that you can go and take advantage of. One of them is GIMP. I'm going to be frank with you. I really, really dislike GIMP because it's trying so hard not to be Photoshop that it violates industry standard terms and just ends up being confusing. But it's been around for quite a while now, and a lot of people like it, and I recognize that it's made huge strides. It's a personal annoyance with it, but GIMP is one that you can use. It's www.gimp.org. I will link to it in the course information section if you want to go and download it. GIMP is an option. There is also Krita that you can do and use. Krita I will also link to. It is another freeware open source one. In my experience, Krita has the habit of crashing very quickly, very often, but it's a lot more of a robust program than GIMP, at least I feel it personally is, and it's more familiar as a Photoshop user. But you can use those, of course, have access to Photoshop. You can use that. There's also some programs who run a little bit cheaper or other options. My personal painting program is Clip Studio Paint, and that goes on sale for $25 relatively often. It's more expensive usually, but it's worth snagging on sale if you are a person who is interested in digital painting. But you've got a few things to do, and again, I'll put both of these links in our course information section, so you can go and grab one of these if you need to grab one of these, because it because you need to go through and color things. You are welcome to use whatever program you want to color, and we're going to start off talking about some color theory basics, and then we'll go through a few program specifics for those of you who need it that way. Those of you who know how to use programs such as Photoshop, you won't have to listen to the very last part of this lecture. Okay, let's talk coloring. I have opened this in GIMP because it's, again, a freeware program, so I know it's going to cover those of you who need more instructions, and then I don't have to repeat things when I go into some program specifics. But I want to talk about some general things you need to think about when coloring something. So First and foremost, you can open it up, File, Open, navigate to where it's saved, double click to open it. GIMP may scream at you about this offset layer. Just click Ignore PNG Offset. So that's going to open up the file, and it's going to be very hard to see what's going on and filled with this grid because a PNG is transparent by default. It doesn't have the, there we go. It doesn't have a background. So we need to go through and make that background layer, and you're going to want to do the same thing in Photoshop. We can make the background layer by going up here to Layer, New Layer. When we're creating a new layer, you're going to want to go down here to the Fill With to make it solid. And by default, if you kept your colors as white for your UV colors, you're going to go down here and say Fill With Foreground Color, because our colors in GIMP are black as the foreground or the active color, white as the background color. Our lines are white, so we want to go ahead and fill this with black. If you made your UV lines black, reverse that and fill it with the background color. I'm going to leave everything else the same. We're going to go OK. Now we've got a big black box. That's because the black layer here is the top layer. So it is the layer we're seeing in most art programs here. It's order of top to bottom, so whatever's on top is what we're going to view first. So click on that layer and hold and drag it under your other layer. Now we can see all of our lines on top of that. We can see everything that's going on. And any other layer we're going to want to smack in between these. We're going to get rid of these lines eventually. We just want to be able to see them so that we can work with them here. So when we're working on our objects, we want to make sure that we're painting on nice, happy, fresh layers. I would recommend 1 layer per color so that you can move them around if you need be. And we're going to go through and we're going to paint what we're going to want these to look like. So I'm going to click down here on that black layer. I'm going to go up and create a new layer. This time I'm going to change Fill With Transparency, so it will be transparent. Go ahead and click OK. If it's not in between your 2 layers, you can go through and move it. It can be helpful to name your layers. You can do this up here in the layer name. So I could name this, for example, Body Color, so that everything's nice and clear. And that will help you organize if things need to be. But we're going to want to go through and lay in our base color. The first thing you want to do is lay in your base color tones so that you can make sure they work together, they look good together, everything is colored appropriately. And in GIMP, we want to go over to the brush panel that's up here in the upper right. I'm going to click on the farthest right of the second row, which is just a nice hard brush. And then we're going to want to go over and select our paintbrush tool, which is our toolbox over here in the upper left. And it's the one above the capital letter A. And I now have a brush. We can make our brushes bigger or smaller by holding the bracket tools, or you can make it bigger or smaller by changing the size here. But I just want a big, nice, chunky brush. And what I want to do is go and paint in all of the body, make a new layer, paint in all of the face, make a new layer, paint in the beak, make a new layer, paint in the eyes, etc., etc., etc. So we're going to want to think about what colors we want to do this. Sometimes you're going to have reference art. Sometimes you're going to be pulling from a real piece of an object, or have various shifts in there. To change our color, we can click on our little black color marker here in the upper left. It's going to break this up. Gonna bring up our color foreground. Sorry for the random background there momentarily. What we've got going on is we've got our hue, or our color value is this slider bar right here. So we can kind of find the color we want. For example, if we want a sort of orangish red owl, I can go down here into sort of orangish red. It goes Roy-G Biv and then into magenta. So red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet, purple, and then back to red. So we can find the color range we want. And then what we have here is our brightness and our saturation. So it's choosing for us basically how much white versus color we want in an object. So how much saturation we want. and then how pure that color we want up in the white or color range, and how much black we want in that. So we can click and hold and move this around until we get the color we want. Whatever is listed here in current is the color that we have active. So doesn't matter which your pick if you follow along. I'm just going to go sort of with this orangey brown. When you're happy with it, click OK. I'm going to go back over here, double check that I'm on the body color layer. I can tell that's the one I'm on because it has this selection around it. And I'm just going to click and hold and color all of that in. It does not matter if I'm outside the lines. This is why we split everything up into its own section here, because it's in its own nice, happy little place. As long as I'm not going through into other lines, so as long as the body's not going into the face, I don't care if I'm outside the lines. So I'm just going to color it all in, and then I'm going to go and create a new layer. And then I'm going to go back in and name it face color. I'm going to select whatever I want to be the face color. And then I'm going to go in and I'm going to paint the face. And we're going to repeat this process until we have all of the other things. Now, you don't need every single thing to be on its own layer. It's good with things that are close. But I could say, for example, face detail colors, so that I can do both the eyes and the beak at the same time and not have to worry about them being separate. So again, not everything needs to be off on its own layers, but we can certainly move things onto its own layers if we want to. So it's up to you how much you break things up. So getting our base colors in, then analyzing them, seeing if they work, if we like them, if we don't like them. If you're not sure if you like something and you want to modify it, we can always re-pick up that layer with the color picker tool. Color picker tool is to the right of the capital letter A. And then we can go through and shift this around. I'm not expecting you guys to be color theory geniuses or anything like that. But you want to, at this stage, go through and just manipulating the colors. Putting these in are basically putting in our flat colors. Our flat colors are our very base level colors. And for some texturing styles, going in with flat colors can work. It tends to be very plain and very basic in that process. And something that you tend to want to do is go in and add a little bit of nuance of colors. And there's a few ways that we can go about adding nuances of colors. I will specify those out in a moment, but the idea of that is broken color. And broken color, be it very subtle or very obvious, gives a lot of life to a piece, because nothing in the real world, or very few things in the real world, even if they're supposed to be, are perfectly smooth one color. Because a perfectly smooth surface is nigh impossible. Even that nice cast piece of plastic has a little bit of surface texture, a little bit of surface mar. So by going in and adding in that broken color, adding in a little bit of noise, gives us a great ability to make a robust thing possible. We may also want to go in and paint some details in. We may be looking at a piece and we may decide, you know what, I do want my wings a little bit darker. So we may go in and paint those wings a little bit darker and work in some manipulations to make those work. We have all of our lines available for us, so we can see exactly where the lines are. So we can either paint in there very precisely or use selection tools to go in there and refine those things a little bit within that. But we could also paint in any details we need. But this gives us a nice happy layer. So painting in details, adding broken color. We might add in broken color with brushes that are going to add in that noise of color. We might add in broken colors with various filters that are going to add in broken color. Those of you using Photoshop, going in and rendering clouds is a great way to add in some noise and some broken color in there. We'll talk about some things that you can do here in GIMP in a moment here. So combination of different brushes, by rendering in noise, by painting in details, we would end up refining this. When you're ready to save it out, you're going to want to hide your layer with all of your lines. Otherwise, your lines are going to be part of your design. So make sure you go in here and click on the eye to turn off the visibility on our UV layer. And then you're going to want to go and save it out. You know, I'm going to have to look at how to export this out of GIMP. Again, I'm not a GIMP user here at all. I have not used GIMP for, quite frankly, probably a decade. There we go, export. We're going to want to go in and save out our piece. Now, when you save out your piece, you always want to name it things that make sense. So you don't want to name it as a UV because we have the UV in there. We don't want that. So we want to name it something like color. So it's in there. You can leave them as PNGs. You can also save them out as JPEGs or TIFFs if you prefer. I'm just going to leave it as the same file type. I'm going to go through here, click export. Going to double check that my compression layer is all the way at the highest. So it's not compressing it. Clicks export. This now gives me the color that I can go in and attach in my hyper shader like we've done previously. So traveling back here over to Maya, I can open up my hypershade. Oh, goodness. Smaller, please. I can open up my hypershade, which is giant for some reason. And I can go through the same process that we looked at last week. So I can go ahead and make a new texture. I can select a file for that texture. I can go through and find the correct folder. Sorry, I have two different hard drives, so gotta run around. I can find the color that I made. Go ahead and attach that. And apply the Lambert. Let's name this something that makes sense. Apply my material to that. Turn on the material so that I can view it. And voila! I have my textured figure. It's nice and happy for me. So we can go through and apply the texture as need be. Now the other thing to think about at this point is, do we need a bump map of any sort? Do we want to go ahead and have any manipulation with those? Maybe we want a little bit of texture in the wings to give it a little bit of texture and noise that's going on. If we're going to want to do that, we can work on this same file. We could also open a new file. I prefer to work things in the same file. What I like to do is to make a new folder or layer group. So layer, new layer group. I am going to drag all of my color pieces into that layer group so that I can hide that layer group. So I have all of my colors here available for me if I need to work on them. And then I'm going to go and instead create a bump map. Now, the important thing about bump maps is that we want them to be a medium gray by default. We want to be over here as a color that is 0 on the H, 0 on the S, and 50 on the V. This color is going to be what we want as our base layer for our bump maps, because this means flat. If it's black, it's indented. If it's white, it rays. We want this to be nice and flat. So I'm going to go to my paint bucket tool. It's right to the left of my brush. After I have that gray selected, paste it in. This is going to make sure that nothing gets raised or lower that I don't want to be raised or lower. And then I would go through the same process of painting in what I want accordingly. You can, of course, create a new layer on top of this if you don't want to accidentally paint on the gray, so you can always erase what you need. But I would go through and paint whatever I feel is appropriate to go in and paint to get the noise level I want. Oops. So maybe I want to just go in with this sort of speckly brush here, and I just want to paint in some speckles. So I would go through and apply whatever bump map. I'm not going to do a pretty job of this at all. Or draw whatever bump map that I would need for whatever level of bump and displacement I want. So if I just want some speckled bumps in, I can go in with a slightly darker gray and paste them in. Now you do need to be careful of your seams, because remember, if it starts on one side and it doesn't wrap around to the other side, this is where you're going to see the seams. Seams can be an issue. This is why we want them hidden. And if we're doing broken color or bump maps, that can get in there. I'm not expecting perfect seams out of you today. But just keep that in mind. But I would go through and do whatever level of work I want in this. If there's something that you turns out that you didn't want, we can always go back to the eraser tool and erase through. We can erase through with any one of our brushes. So if we wanted to follow a line precisely to make sure that these bumples aren't on the wings, we go and erase any of those bumples who extended onto the wings. Once again, we want to hide our lines. We want to go and we want to export this. Again, name it something that makes sense, such as displacement or bump. There you go. Let's try to type correctly. Export that out. Once we have that exported out, we can go back over here to Maya and we can work on this and select a file. Go over to our file and we can find our bump map. And now we've got the bumpled texture all over our who. And we can go through and play around with that bump until it's effective. So we can do whatever layers, whatever textures, whatever look we need within that process to make this work more successfully and get this to look like what we want. Again, the basic level I'm looking for you today is your ability to separate parts into very easy color areas so that you can color them separate things decently. The idea of breaking into broken color, and again, I'll go over a little bit of details of those in a moment, and knowing how to put and apply a bump map. So you can go through this process and all these steps. And again, if you missed what I was doing here in the Hypershade, go and back and listen to last week's lecture if you need to, but this lecture is getting long enough as it is. A few things for us to wrap up to cover before we wrap up though. So real quickly, for my darlings who are going to be using Photoshop, you'll start off the same way, painting in what you need to paint, picking the colors that you want to pick, making your layers, separating it, etc. To do broken colors, you do have a medley of brushes that you might want to use, such as our special effects brushes. There's a number of various splatter brushes and noise brushes in there that you might choose to use. So we might try to go in with this dry concept brush, for example, and go in and add in some noise in that manner. So you can go in and do that sort of thing if you want to. But one of the easiest ways to go in and add in noise is to get yourself your base color and either a lighter version and a darker version of that base color, and go up here into filter and go into render clouds. It's rendered in some clouds, so this is broken color basically here. It is best, to render that in on its own layer. All right, let's go through and do that again. Render it on its own layer, and then you're going to want to clip that layer to the one below it, and you're going to want to consider lowering its opacity. And what we basically want is the sense of some noise, some variegation, but it's usually better if it's pretty subtle. So broken noise or broken color is very easily done inside of Photoshop. We can just go into our filters, render clouds as its own layer, clip it, lower its opacity. So that's a very convenient thing to do. But to go in and add our bumpo texture, our bumpo noise, those kind of things like that, or our actual bump map, we could definitely use those various brushes. You can play around with other filters. Filters are great to go in here and do that. If you want a little bit more, you can even add noise to add noise as a filter. This one is useful. Again, generally very subtle. To add a little bit of noise and a little bit of space, you can see your preview here. That can be another good way to add some subtle broken color, but you can go in and make those sort of changes. But specifically for Photoshop users, I wanted to point out that render clouds is an incredibly useful way, once you clip it and lower the opacity, to add in a little bit of broken color very quickly. Those are you who are not going to be using GIMP, you're done with the lecture, you can go forth and do the homework, which is basically the same process that we just went through, just with a different figure and a different thought process going through. So when you go and do the other figure, I want you to think about where the seams are going to be most hidden. I want you to think about what's going on with the reference. It's not a reference you have to follow example specifically, but there are specific color breaks that you do need to look at, which are detailed in the assignment, and how you might go about doing the process. Okay, GIMP users. Let's wander back over to here. So I'm going to hide all these things of our layer. We have some similar options within GIMP if we so choose to take advantage of those options. They're running in the same area. They're running here in filters. So any of these things we can go through and select. And our most useful one are going to be the noise filter and the render filter generally, but there's some other interesting things running around. So what our noise filter does is there's various ways to add noise, and honestly, you're just going to have to go around and play with these to see what you like. But generally, any filter we click on is going to give us a preview of what the filter looks like. If it's not giving you a preview, check preview. And it's giving us options to change the way that this noise looks. So you can play around with all of these slider boxes until it's the type of noise that you want. And when you're happy with it, you can go and press OK. So noise is one of the ways that we can add in some broken color. It can also be really useful to add in a slight texture in a displacement map, in a bump map. So you may want to use that on that type of space also. So it's one of the things that we can do, but we can also do the same thing as in Photoshop of rendering our clouds. We're once again going to want to go ahead and create a new layer for us. And we're going to want to then go into filter, down into render, and there's various things that we can render. Noise is where a number of useful things are going to be, but again, you can really play around with all of these and see what they can do. Our cell noise here could be really good again for a displacement map or things like that. Get back down to noise. We can find potentially some use in some of these other ones like simple noise, where we can change sort of the scale, and the blobs can be a good thing for broken color within there. But we can go forward and design other things. A lot of the noises are pre-done color or black and white, which is useful for bump maps, but not so much for color. But once we've made them, we can go over here to our layer space and change the mode from mode normal into something like mode multiply or burn or overlay or soft light. And you can see now we're seeing the colors below it. If we want them to be less intense, we can also change the opacity and change the look of what those things are going to go on so that there's just a little bit of that noise going on. Again, you're going to start have to play around with the noise and see how it does what you want. But by changing this mode, if it's black and white, to something like overlay, soft light, multiply, or burn are the most useful ones generally, and then lower the opacity, we can still get a very interesting look going on. Now, I don't know if there's a way to do a clipping mask in GIMP, but if you do create one of these layers and we only want it selecting one of the colors, you can go to that color layer. We can use our, well, what's the magic wand tool in other programs, which is one above the brush. We can click on the space where the color isn't. If you need to select more than one area, you can hold shift and click there. Go back to your layer where the noise is, hit delete, and now it's only on that layer. When you're done, go to select none. And that will keep it only working on the color. There may be another way to do it. Again, I'm not a GIMP user. I'm just trying to give you a freeware version you can use at home. So those are some of the same things you can do to make this more interesting. Again, I'm not expecting you to be a full-on artist. I'm not expecting you to paint in things necessarily, but I am expecting you to be able to go in, use the brush tool, use the eraser tools to get rid of the brushes where you don't want them to be, and be able to add in the broken color. I do want to talk a little bit about those brush tools and those eraser tools. Um, if we need to, I want to talk real quickly about these softer tools. So the very first brush I had you pick was a very sort of harsh brush. And that was about or in the purpose of going through and just giving down our base color. Man, I really hate that that does not stay. Okay. But if we want to go in and fade in something softly, like we want to do something in on our wings and have a little bit of the pink in the wings in a soft way, we could go to these brushes that have fuzzier edges. And so these are softer brushes. They're not going to have that hard edge. So by making a bigger, softer brush, we can paint in a brush that's going to have that soft edge. We can go in and change some of the properties in here. If you want basically a nice big brush is going to be a nice big level of fuzziness. So if we want the wings to sort of fade into pink, we can paint a softer pink up in the higher areas we want. We can go back to a little bit of a harder brush, paint it in more solid pink down there at the bottom parts of the wings. And then we can go back in with our red, or if this was on its own layer, you can make as many layers as you need. The body color doesn't have to be all in one layer. We could either go in with the eraser and erase around this, or we could go back in with our, let's make sure we go back to the right tools. We could go back in with our hard edge brush and we could paint away everywhere we don't want that faded pink. So it's just where that wing is. So we have the ability to actually go in and add a pretty high level of detail, even though we may not be artists. And look at that. I'm zooming in here with my zoom in tool. So I'm zooming in so I'm a little bit closer so I can go in and work in the brush more appropriately. But we can go in and we can make those things sort of run around and happen and go in with some level of detail. So even with some very basic tools, we can make something that looks pretty interesting and is pretty well refined. I just was scribbling around there without paying attention and went all the way through the wing. Let me look here real quickly. There's really no polygon left too. To the right of the magic wand tool and above the paint bucket, we do have the free select tool here. So you can also go in and draw selections. I'm clicking and holding with that tool and drawing a selection until I get back to the start. And then we can go in and appropriately paint in that selection, or if this was its own layer for the wing color, I could just hit delete and get rid of all of that faded pink. I hit Control D to go back to my regular view here. And I could select out that pink. So that's another option. We can use the selection tools to get rid of this. If we decide our pink is too harsh going from the wing into the body, we could go back to our very soft brush tools, of course, and with our regular red, and we can go back in there and we could paint in that process to make sure I'm on the right layer and paint in that process here. So there's a lot of back and forth we can do to create some very interesting things very simply, even if we don't have a large amount of skill with art. And a lot of that is about just adding in the subtle details, like a little bit of a different color down here. It's about doing things like going in and adding in that broken color. We don't have to be an artist to create a decent looking texture. To create a good texture, yeah, there's things that we're going to want to go in and do, and it does take a high level of skill. I'm not belittling texture artists in the least. Texture artists and texturing is actually what I was intending to go into in the industry before I decided that I was going to go into teaching. So believe me, I have a real love for it, but I don't want anybody panicking because they're not an artist. I'm going in and doing these things, but adding a little bit of detail, a little bit of noise, a little bit of information can be a really nice thing to make our pieces look more robust. So just go through, recognize that this needs a lot of patience and this needs a lot of care, and give yourself the patience and take breaks between these various steps if you need to. And when you're in GIMP, make a bunch of layers if you need a bunch of layers. Doesn't matter if you have 20 layers when you're painting a texture. That's not unusual to have 20 or more layers when you're painting a texture. Just go through and work within that and within that process. And remember, color maps you're going to want as a separate thing from your bump maps. And with your bump map, please make sure to put in that base 50% gray and work darker than it to sink things in. and work lighter than it to raise things up. And again, that 50% gray is all the way over here on the left side. It's 0 on the H, 0 on the S, 50% on the V. That is what is flat on your bump map. Okay, good luck, and as always, reach out to me if you need help or if you have any questions. And at the end of it, you too can have textured critters.